The discovery that would eventually reveal one of antebellum Florida's most terrifying supernatural accounts occurred not during 1854, when events originally transpired, but rather in 1923, when elderly woman named Clara Washington, granddaughter of woman named Delphine who had been enslaved at Homestead called Cypress Ridge, near Tallahassee during 1850s, shared family's oral traditions with folklorists collecting narratives about African-American religious practices and spiritual beliefs throughout rural Florida, narratives that documented voodoo traditions, hoodoo practices, conjure work, and other African-derived spiritual systems that enslaved people and their descendants had maintained, despite systematic attempts by white authorities to suppress all non-Christian religious expressions that white society viewed as dangerous superstitions threatening social order, through providing enslaved people with spiritual resources and with beliefs about supernatural power that could potentially be directed against masters whose authority white supremacy insisted was absolute and unchallengeable. The specific account Clara provided involved her grandmother Delphine, who during 1854 had created 6 voodoo dolls representing 6 members of Homestead owner's family, dolls whose construction and whose ritual activation through pins, through herbs, through spoken incantations, and through blood offerings had allegedly produced 6 deaths occurring over 6 months from March through August 1854, deaths that white authorities attributed to natural causes, including fever, accident, mysterious illness whose symptoms physicians could not explain adequately, and one apparent suicide, though enslaved witnesses insisted deaths represented supernatural justice, delivered precisely as Delphine had intended, through ritual work punishing family that had inflicted extraordinary cruelty on enslaved workers, whose suffering exceeded even slavery's normal brutality. Subscribe immediately, like this video, and comment where you're watching from, because Delphine's 6 voodoo dolls killed 6 people in ways that will make you question everything you think you know about slavery's power dynamics and about what enslaved people could accomplish when white violence pushed them beyond limits of endurance. The context establishing how Delphine came to create 6 voodoo dolls targeting entire family involved series of events beginning in 1853 when Homestead owner named Jonathan Blackwell, 48 years old, wealthy by Florida standards, though not reaching wealth levels of major cotton or sugar plantation owners in deep South states like Alabama or Louisiana, owner of approximately 60 enslaved people whose labor cultivated cotton and corn on 1,500 acres that Jonathan had acquired through purchases and through grants available to white settlers willing to develop Florida's interior regions during territorial period and during early decades of statehood following 1845, admission to Union decided that enslaved woman named Patience, who worked as domestic servant, had stolen silver spoon from C.A. Guy's house, accusation that Patience vehemently denied, but that Jonathan refused to accept her denials about, because accepting enslaved person's word against white person's suspicions would have violated fundamental premises of slavery, requiring that masters' judgments remain unquestioned regardless of evidence or lack thereof supporting their conclusions. The punishment Jonathan imposed for alleged theft involved not merely whipping that Patience received, 50 lashes administered publicly before assembled enslaved workers whose forced witnessing of brutal punishment was designed to terrorize them into submission and to demonstrate consequences of displeasing master, whose authority extended to inflicting extreme violence without requiring proof of wrongdoing beyond his own suspicions or his own arbitrary decisions about what constituted unacceptable behavior deserving punishment. But punishment extended beyond whipping to include Jonathan's decision to sell Patience's 3 children away from Cypress Ridge to slave trader who would transport them to markets in New Orleans, where they would be sold to buyers whose identities and locations Patience would never learn. Sales that destroyed Patience's family and that inflicted emotional trauma that physical punishment alone could never have accomplished, regardless of how brutal whipping might have been. The separation occurred on November 15, 1853, when children ages 5, 7, and 9 were taken from Patience, who collapsed screaming and had to be physically restrained by other enslaved workers to prevent her from attacking Jonathan or attacking trader who was loading children onto wagon that would transport them to Tallahassee, where they would begin journey toward New Orleans and toward fates that Patience could only imagine with horror, knowing that children sold into Deep South's sugar plantations faced life expectancy. size rarely exceeding 5 years from purchase date, because brutal labor conditions and systematic overwork killed workers faster than they could be replaced through natural reproduction, requiring constant purchases from domestic slave trade to maintain labor forces necessary for profitable operations. The psychological collapse that Patience experienced following her children's sale involved her becoming catatonic for several days, during which she neither spoke nor ate nor responded to attempts by other enslaved workers to comfort her or to help her process trauma that had destroyed her will to continue living under conditions where everything she loved could be taken from her at any moment through masters' arbitrary decisions that she possessed. She had no capacity to challenge or resist through any means that slavery's legal frameworks recognized as legitimate. The recovery that eventually occurred involved Patience emerging from catatonic state, but emerging fundamentally changed from person she had been before children's sale, changed from submissive domestic worker who had accepted her enslavement as unchangeable reality into person whose rage and whose determination to punish Jonathan for crime he had committed against her family would manifest through voodoo practices that she learned from Delphine, who was recognized within Cypress Ridge's enslaved community as possessing knowledge about conjure work and about spiritual practices capable of affecting physical reality through mechanisms that white rationality denied, but that African spiritual traditions recognized as real forces whose operation required specialized knowledge and required ritual procedures that practitioners like Delphine had learned from elders who had learned from their elders, extending back through generations to African origins, where such practices had been integral aspects of religious and healing traditions that slavery attempted to destroy, but that enslaved people preserved through oral transmission and through secret practice conducted beyond white observation and white interference. The relationship that developed between Patience and Delphine during weeks following children's sale involved Patience seeking Delphine's assistance in obtaining revenge against Jonathan through spiritual means, because physical resistance would have been immediately suppressed through overwhelming violence and would have resulted in Patience's death or in her being sold to conditions even worse than those she currently endured at Cypress Ridge. Delphine initially hesitated to assist Patience because conjure work targeting white people carried extraordinary risks. If white authorities discovered that enslaved person had attempted to harm white person through voodoo or through other supernatural means, punishment would involve not merely execution of practitioner, but likely would involve brutal suppression of entire enslaved community through mass whippings, through sales separating families, and through enhanced surveillance and enhanced restrictions designed to prevent any future attempts at spiritual resistance against white authority. But Delphine ultimately agreed to teach Patience necessary procedures for creating voodoo dolls and for activating them through rituals that would direct harmful influences toward targeted individuals. Agreed because she recognized that Patience's suffering exceeded what any person should be expected to endure without seeking justice through whatever means were available, even if those means involved risks that more cautious people might consider unacceptable. The expansion of Patience's revenge plans from targeting only Jonathan to targeting his entire family occurred during conversations with Delphine about scope of punishment that Jonathan's crime deserved, occurred through Patience concluding that Jonathan's wife Martha and their 4 children, daughters ages 16, 14, and 11, and son age 8, bore responsibility through their complicity in slavery system, even though they had not directly participated in decision to sell Patience's children, and even though they had not personally committed any specific acts of cruelty beyond general exploitation inherent in their positions as beneficiaries of enslaved labor whose suffering generated wealth supporting their comfortable lifestyle. The moral calculation Patience made involved concluding that family members who benefited from slavery and who participated in system through accepting its fruits without protest or resistance deserved punishment, alongside Jonathan, whose direct agency in selling her children made him primary target, but whose family's participation in exploitation meant they shared guilt, even if their guilt was less direct than Jonathan's personal responsibility for specific decision that had destroyed Patience's family and had destroyed her capacity to continue accepting enslavement as unchangeable reality that she needed to accommodate rather than resist through any available means. The construction of 6 voodoo dolls representing Jonathan, Martha, and 4 children occurred during January 1854 in secret location in woods beyond Cypress Ridge's cultivated fields, where Patience and Delphine could work without being observed by white overseers or by enslaved workers who might reveal their activities to authorities, either through deliberate betrayal motivated by fear of collective punishment if conjure work was discovered, or through accidental disclosure during conversations that white people might overhear. The dolls themselves were constructed using materials whose symbolic properties enhanced their efficacy, according to Voodoo traditions. Cloth, taken from clothing belonging to each targeted family member, providing personal connection necessary for directing spiritual influences toward specific individuals. Spanish moss for binding, representing entanglement and constraint. Graveyard dirt representing death and decay. Various herbs whose properties aligned with harmful intentions, including Jimson weed and nightshade, whose toxic qualities in physical realm corresponded to toxic spiritual influences that dolls would direct toward targets when properly activated through rituals. The faces that Delphine carved on dolls using small knife represented specific family members whose features she had observed during years working at Cypress Ridge, before being transferred to field labor, following incident where Martha had accused her of insolence for failing to lower her eyes quickly enough when Martha addressed her. Transfer that had reduced Delphine's status, but had also reduced her direct contact with family, whose oversight had been oppressive, and whose constant supervision had prevented her from pursuing spiritual practices that fieldwork's relative independence now allowed. The ritual activation of 6 dolls occurred across 6 nights during late January 1854, when moon was waning toward new moon phase, whose darkness provided appropriate spiritual conditions for work intended to diminish and destroy rather than to build or heal. Activation that involved Patience and Delphine conducting ceremonies at midnight, when boundary between physical and spiritual realms was thinnest, according to Voodoo cosmology, and when ancestors and spirits could most easily cross into material world to accomplish tasks that living practitioners requested through proper procedures and through proper offerings, demonstrating respect for spiritual entities whose assistance was being sought. The procedures involved lighting candles whose colors corresponded to destructive intentions, black candles representing death and ending, red candles representing blood and violence, involved burning herbs whose smoke carried prayers and intentions into spiritual realm, where they would be received by entities capable of manifesting those intentions in physical reality, involved blood offerings using chickens, whose sacrifice provided spiritual payment for work being requested, because nothing of value could be obtained from spiritual realm without providing appropriate compensation, demonstrating seriousness of practitioners' intentions and demonstrating respect for spiritual forces, whose cooperation was necessary for successful outcomes. The placement of pins into each doll occurred after activation rituals had established connections between dolls and targeted individuals, placement that followed specific patterns corresponding to types of harm intended for different family members. Pins in Jonathan's doll targeted heart and head, representing desire for his death to occur through heart failure or through stroke. Pins in Martha's doll targeted throat and lungs, representing desire for respiratory illness to suffocate her slowly. Pins in children's dolls targeted various organs and systems, representing desire for their deaths to occur through different mechanisms that would make pattern less obvious than if all 6 deaths occurred through identical causes that might raise suspicions about supernatural intervention rather than natural diseases or accidents, whose randomness would make them appear unfortunate but explainable through material causation that white rationality insisted represented only valid form of causation worthy of serious consideration. The first death occurred on March 3rd of 1854, less than 6 weeks after Patience and Delphine had completed ritual activation of 6 voodoo dolls and had begun daily maintenance work involving lighting candles before dolls, whispering prayers and incantations reinforcing harmful intentions directed toward Blackwell family, and inserting additional pins into dolls at strategic locations corresponding to organs and systems whose failure would produce deaths appearing to result from natural causes rather than from supernatural intervention that white authorities would never accept as legitimate explanation, regardless of how suspicious timing or circumstances might appear to observers willing to consider possibilities beyond material causation that European scientific Frameworks insisted, represented only valid mechanisms through which events in physical world could occur. The victim was Jonathan's youngest daughter, Mary, age 11, who had been a healthy child showing no signs of illness when she went to bed on evening of March 2nd, but who was found dead in her bed on morning of March 3rd by domestic servant who had entered room to wake her for breakfast and who discovered body already cold, indicating death had occurred hours earlier during night when no one had heard any sounds of distress or struggle suggesting death. Had come quickly and quietly, in ways that made determining cause extraordinarily difficult for physician, who examined body and who concluded after inconclusive examination that Mary had probably died from heart failure, whose specific cause could not be determined through diagnostic methods available in 1854, when understanding of cardiac conditions remained rudimentary and when sudden deaths in children were attributed to various vague diagnoses. Ho's actual meanings, physicians themselves often did not fully understand, beyond recognizing that sometimes healthy people died suddenly without warning and without obvious external causes that post-mortem examination could identify. The grief that consumed Blackwell family following Mary's death involved typical mourning rituals for wealthy white families in antebellum Florida, including elaborate funeral conducted by Presbyterian minister from Tallahassee, burial in family cemetery on Cypress Ridge property, where Jonathan's parents and 2 infant children who had died during 1830s were already interred. Hand period of seclusion, during which Martha wore black mourning dress and received condolence visits from neighboring white families, whose expressions of sympathy reflected genuine sadness about child's death, combined with relief that their own children remained healthy, and combined with unspoken recognition that childhood mortality remained common enough during 1850s that every family understood possibility that disease or accident or mysterio, say sudden death, might take their children despite all precautions and despite best available medical care that wealth could purchase. The response among enslaved workers at Cypress Ridge to Mary's death involved publicly performing expected grief and sympathy for master's loss, while privately many believed that death represented first fruits of patients' voodoo work, believed that Mary's death was no accident or natural occurrence, but rather represented deliberate supernatural intervention, delivering justice to family that had inflicted suffering on patients through selling her children, and that had inflicted suffering on all enslaved workers at Cypress Ridge, through systematic exploitation and through casual cruelties that characterized daily operations under Jonathan's management, whose harshness exceeded most Florida homesteads imposed, because Jonathan believed that maintaining discipline required demonstrating willingness to employ extreme violence against any worker who showed insufficient deference or insufficient productivity, according to standards that Jonathan established without consulting workers about whether such standards were reasonable or achievable. The second death occurred on April 17, 1854, 6 weeks after Mary's death and approximately 11 weeks after Voodoo doll's activation, when Jonathan's son Robert, age 8, drowned in pond located on Cypress Ridge property, where he had gone fishing alone despite his mother's instructions that he should not go to pond without adult supervision, because she feared exactly the accident that ultimately occurred. The circumstances of Robert's drowning remained mysterious, because he was known to be a competent swimmer who had swum in pond numerous times previously without incident, because pond's depth was only approximately 6 feet at its deepest point, meaning that even if Robert had cramped or had encountered difficulty, he should have been able to stand with head above water and walk to shore. And because Robert's body, when discovered, showed no signs of struggle or panic that would typically characterize drowning victim who had fought desperately to reach surface before lungs filled with water and consciousness faded into death. The physician who examined Robert's body concluded that death had resulted from drowning, but could not explain why capable swimmer had drowned in relatively shallow pond under circumstances suggesting he had made no effort to save himself, could not explain why Robert appeared to have simply sunk beneath water's surface and remained there until death occurred, without attempting to surface or without attempting to swim to shore that was never more than 15 feet away, regardless of where in pond drowning had occurred. The speculation that circulated among white community about Robert's death involved some people suggesting that perhaps he had struck his head on submerged log or rock, rendering him unconscious before he could react to danger. Speculation that post-mortem examination failed to confirm because Robert's head showed no bruising or injury consistent with such impact. Other speculation involved possibility that Robert had suffered some kind of seizure or sudden medical crisis that had incapacitated him before he could call for help. Speculation that again could not be confirmed through available diagnostic methods, and that remained merely hypothesis, attempting to explain death whose actual cause remained unknown, despite physicians' official conclusion that drowning had occurred. The response among enslaved workers at Cypress Ridge involved increased certainty that patients' voodoo work was producing intended effects, involved enslaved people whispering among themselves that 2 children dead within 6 weeks could not represent mere coincidence, especially given that both deaths had occurred under circumstances that seemed almost supernaturally convenient for someone wishing harm upon Blackwell family. Mary dying suddenly in her sleep without any prior illness, Robert drowning in pond where he was experienced swimmer under conditions that defied rational explanation about why capable child had made no effort to save himself from death that should have been easily avoidable. The third death occurred on May 22, 1854, 5 weeks after Robert's drowning and approximately 4 months after Voodoo Doll's activation, when Jonathan's eldest daughter Caroline, age 16, died from fever, whose onset had been sudden and whose progression had been rapid despite physicians' treatments including bloodletting, administration of quinine, and various other interventions that 19th-century medicine employed against fevers, whose specific causes physicians typically could not identify beyond recognizing that patient was experiencing elevated temperature and was experiencing various symptoms including chills, sweating, delirium, and progressive weakness that characterized many different infectious diseases whose similar presentations made differential diagnosis extraordinarily difficult using diagnostic methods available during 1850s. The fever that killed Caroline progressed from first symptoms to death across only 4 days, progression that was rapid but not unprecedented for various infectious diseases including typhoid, yellow fever, malaria in severe form, or other conditions that could kill quickly when patients' immune system failed to mount adequate response, or when medical interventions proved inadequate or actually harmful, as bloodletting often was, despite its widespread use by physicians who believed that removing blood would help restore balance of bodily humors, whose imbalance they believed caused most diseases, despite such theories having no basis in actual physiological mechanisms that medical science would eventually discover through methods not yet developed during 1850s. The psychological impact on Martha and Jonathan of losing 3 children within 3 months involved progression from grief over Mary's death through intensified grief, combined with growing anxiety after Robert's drowning through near-complete psychological collapse after Caroline's death, when pattern became undeniable that something extraordinary was occurring beyond mere tragic coincidence that might have explained 1 death or even 2 deaths, but that strained credulity when attempting to explain 3 deaths of healthy children occurring within 3 months when family had not lost any children during previous 16 years since Caroline's birth, except for 2 infant deaths during 1830s that were unfortunately common, but that had not been followed by additional child deaths until sudden cluster of 3 deaths during spring of 1854. The minister who counseled Martha and Jonathan during this period attempted to provide spiritual comfort through assuring them that God's will was mysterious and that sometimes faithful Christians experienced tribulations whose purposes would only be revealed in afterlife, when earthly suffering would be understood as tests of faith or as preparation for heavenly rewards that would compensate for earthly losses. But such spiritual counseling provided minimal comfort to parents, whose grief was compounded by growing terror about whether remaining family members would also die. Terror that manifested in Martha becoming obsessively protective of her 2 remaining daughters, and in Jonathan becoming increasingly paranoid about whether someone was deliberately harming his family through means he could not identify or prevent. The investigation that Jonathan initiated following Caroline's death involved him questioning enslaved workers at Cypress Ridge about whether they knew anything about causes of 3 deaths, or about whether anyone had wished harm upon his family. Questioning that produced no useful information because enslaved workers who knew about patients' voodoo work were not about to reveal such information to Jonathan, whose violent response would have endangered not merely patients and Delphine, but potentially entire enslaved community. If Jonathan decided that collective punishment was necessary to root out conjure practices whose existence he would consider intolerable threats to his authority and to his safety, regardless of whether he actually believed voodoo possessed real power, or whether he dismissed such beliefs as superstitious nonsense, while nevertheless recognizing that enslaved people who believed they possessed supernatural weapons against white authority represented psychological threat, even if actual supernatural causation was impossible, according to rationalist frameworks that Jonathan's education had taught him represented. Only legitimate basis for understanding how world actually operated. The fourth death occurred on June 8, 1854, 17 days after Caroline's death and approximately 4.5 months after Voodoo Doll's activation, when Jonathan's middle daughter Elizabeth, age 14, died under circumstances that appeared to be suicide through hanging using rope that she had obtained from barn, and that she had used to create noose suspended from beam in her bedroom, where her body was discovered by domestic servant who had entered room to wake Elizabeth for bray. Gagfest. The shock of discovering that 14-year-old girl had apparently hanged herself created immediate crisis involving questions about why Elizabeth would have taken her own life, questions whose answers remained elusive because Elizabeth had left no note explaining her action, and because family members reported that while Elizabeth had been obviously grieving her sister's deaths and her brother's death, she had not shown signs of suicidal ideation that would have warned family to take precautions, preventing her from harming herself. The Presbyterian minister who conducted Elizabeth's funeral struggled to address theological implications of suicide, whose commission traditionally was considered sin, requiring denial of Christian burial in consecrated ground, struggled to reconcile church doctrine, condemning suicide with pastoral need to comfort grieving parents who were already devastated by 3 previous deaths and who could not bear additional burden of believing their daughter was damned eternally because of action she had taken during moment of temporary insanity or despair, that minister argued should not be judged according to normal standards of moral responsibility. The alternative explanation that some enslaved workers whispered among themselves involved possibility that Elizabeth had not actually committed suicide, but rather had been killed through supernatural means that made her death appear to be suicide, possibility that Delphine's voodoo work had compelled Elizabeth to hang herself through spiritual influence that had overwhelmed her will and had forced her to perform actions she would never have chosen consciously, but that supernatural compulsion had made irresistible. The theological and philosophical questions such interpretation raised about free will and about moral responsibility were profound. If Elizabeth had been supernaturally compelled to hang herself, then was her death actually suicide deserving theological condemnation? Or was it murder through supernatural means, whose perpetrator was patience employing voodoo powers that Delphine had taught her to use? The answer to such questions depended entirely on whether one accepted supernatural causation as real possibility, or whether one insisted that all events required material explanations whose mechanisms could be understood through rational inquiry and through scientific methods that European intellectual traditions insisted represented only valid approaches to knowledge, despite African spiritual traditions insisting that reality included dimensions transcending material causation and transcend limitations of rationalist frameworks that denied existence of forces whose operation required different epistemologies and different methods for understanding how world actually functioned. The fifth death occurred on July 14, 1854, 5 weeks after Elizabeth's apparent suicide, and approximately 5.5 months after Voodoo Doll's activation, when Martha died from respiratory illness, whose symptoms had begun approximately a week earlier with mild cough that progressively worsened until she was coughing up blood and was experiencing severe difficulty breathing. That physician attributed to pneumonia or possibly tuberculosis, though definitive diagnosis was impossible. Available diagnostic methods. The progression from initial symptoms to death occurred over 9 days, during which Martha's condition steadily deteriorated, despite physicians' treatments, including mustard plasters applied to chest, various tonics and medicines whose efficacy was doubtful, and bloodletting that likely weakened her further, rather than providing any therapeutic benefit, despite physicians' belief that removing blood would help restore bodily balance. and would help patient system fight infection more effectively. The death of Martha following deaths of 4 children within 4 months left Jonathan as sole surviving member of family that had included 6 people when year began, left him psychologically shattered and increasingly convinced that some malevolent force was systematically destroying his family through means he could not identify or defend against, using normal precautions or normal medical interventions that had proven completely ineffective at preventing deaths that seemed to target his family specifically, while other families in region remained healthy, and while other children and adults at Cypress Ridge ESS had no signs of illnesses that had killed his family members. Subscribe and comment whether you believe Patience's voodoo actually killed 5 Blackwell family members, or whether 5 deaths in 5 months represented tragic coincidence, because Jonathan's death is coming and circumstances will force you to choose between supernatural and natural explanations. The final death that would complete pattern of 6 deaths corresponding to 6 voodoo dolls occurred on August 9th, 1854, 3 weeks after Martha's death, and approximately 6.5 months after Patience and Delphine had activated dolls through rituals designed to destroy Blackwell family, whose cruelty toward Patience had motivated revenge, whose scope had expanded to encompass entire family rather than targeting only Jonathan, whose direct responsibility for selling Patience's children made him original focus before Patience had decided that collective guilt justified collective punishment. Jonathan's death occurred under circumstances that combined elements suggesting both natural causes that white rationality would accept as adequate explanation and suspicious details that suggested supernatural intervention to observers willing to consider possibilities beyond material causation that European intellectual frameworks insisted represented only legitimate basis for understanding how events in physical world occurred. The specific circumstances involved Jonathan apparently dying from heart attack that struck while he was alone in his study, late at night, reviewing plantation accounts and attempting to manage Cypress Ridge operations that had deteriorated substantially during previous months, when his psychological state following 5 family members' deaths had left him unable to concentrate on management responsibilities, requiring attention to details and hiring rational decision-making capacity that grief and terror had largely destroyed. The discovery of Jonathan's body occurred on morning of August 10th, when Overseer arrived at Main House to discuss work assignments for enslaved laborers and found Jonathan slumped over desk with papers scattered around him and with expression on his face that Overseer later described as appearing terrified. Despite physicians' insistence that people dying from heart attacks typically did not have time to experience terror or to register emotions, found their faces before death occurred almost instantaneously through sudden cessation of cardiac function. The physician who examined Jonathan's body concluded that death had resulted from heart failure, whose specific cause could not be determined, but that was consistent with acute myocardial infarction that modern medicine would recognize as heart attack resulting from blocked coronary artery, cutting off blood supply to heart muscle, whose cells died rapidly once deprived of oxygen that blood normally delivered. But physicians' conclusion did not explain why Jonathan's face showed expression of terror, did not explain why papers on his desk appeared to have been violently scattered, as though Jonathan had swept them aside during moment of extreme agitation, and did not explain why candle that had been burning on desk had been knocked over and had burned section of desktop before extinguishing itself, suggesting that Jonathan's final moments had involved violent physical movement rather than quiet, sudden collapse that physicians' explanation implied should have characterized death from heart attack. The investigation that local sheriff conducted following Jonathan's death involved questioning whether foul play might have been involved, despite physicians' conclusion that natural causes adequately explained death, involved sheriff examining Jonathan's study for evidence of struggle or for evidence that someone else had been present when Jonathan died, and involved sheriff questioning enslaved workers at Cypress Ridge about whether any of them had seen or heard anything unusual on night of Jonathan's death, or about whether anyone might have wished Jonathan harm beyond general resentment that all enslaved people inevitably felt toward masters whose authority over them was absolute and whose exploitation of them was systematic, regardless of whether individual masters treated them with relative humanity or treated them with extraordinary cruelty exceeding slavery's normal brutality. The questioning produced no useful information from sheriff's perspective, because enslaved workers, who suspected that Patience's voodoo work had killed Jonathan, were not about to share such suspicions with white authorities whose response would have involved brutal suppression of voodoo practices and brutal punishment of anyone suspected of engaging in conjure work targeting white people whose deaths represented intolerable challenges to white supremacy's claims about white people possessing natural superiority that supposedly protected them against any challenges from supposedly inferior black people whose resistance white authority insisted should be easily suppressed through violence that slavery's legal frameworks authorized and that white society's racial ideologies justified. The discovery that occurred several days after Jonathan's death, when domestic servant was cleaning his study, involved finding small cloth bundle hidden behind books on shelf where it would not have been visible unless books were removed and shelf was examined carefully. Bundle whose contents included what appeared to be voodoo doll, roughly resembling human figure with pins stuck through chest and head. Bundle that also included various herbs, whose purposes domestic servant did not recognize, but whose presence alongside doll suggested ritual use rather than medicinal use, for which herbs were commonly employed in various folk healing traditions. The servant's decision about what to do with bundle involved weighing risks of reporting discovery to white authorities, whose response might involve dangerous investigation attempting to identify who had created doll and who had placed it in Jonathan's study, versus risks of concealing discovery and disposing of bundle secretly to prevent it from triggering investigation that might endanger entire enslaved community if white authorities decided that collective punishment was necessary to root out voodoo practices whose existence they would consider intolerable threats, regardless of whether they actually believed voodoo possessed real power or whether they dismissed such beliefs as superstitions that nevertheless required suppression because enslaved people who believed they possessed supernatural weapons represented psychological threats even if actual supernatural causation was impossible. The servant's ultimate decision involved quietly informing Patience and Delphine about Bundle's discovery and allowing them to determine how to dispose of evidence that could potentially link them to Jonathan's death if white authorities examined Bundle carefully, and if they pursued investigation, attempting to determine who had access to Jonathan's study and who possessed knowledge about voodoo practices necessary for creating doll, whose construction required specialized knowledge that not all enslaved people possessed. Despite voodoo and conjure work being relatively widespread within enslaved communities throughout South, where African spiritual traditions had survived, despite systematic attempts to suppress all non-Christian religious expressions, the disposal that Patience and Delphine arranged involved burning Bundle in fire, whose ashes were scattered in woods far from Cypress Ridge's main buildings, disposal that eliminated physical evidence, but that could not eliminate oral traditions, preserving stories about 6 voodoo dolls and 6 deaths, whose timing and whose circumstances convinced many enslaved people that supernatural justice had been delivered precisely as intended through ritual work punishing family, whose cruelty had exceeded even slavery's normal brutality and whose destruction represented demonstration that white authority was not absolute. Despite white supremacy's insistence that white people possessed natural superiority, protecting them against challenges from black people whose supposed inferiority supposedly guaranteed white dominance regardless of circumstances. The aftermath of Blackwell family's complete destruction within 6 months involved immediate crisis about Cypress Ridge's future management because Jonathan's will had not been updated to reflect deaths of Martha and 4 children, and because legal framework governing property inheritance when entire family died without surviving heirs required court proceedings determining how estate should be distributed among distant relatives whose claims to inheritance depended on establishing genealogical connections whose documentation varied in quality and whose interpretation required legal determinations that Florida courts during 1850s were ill-equipped to make efficiently given limited legal infrastructure and given complexity of inheritance law, when standard succession patterns assuming surviving spouse or surviving children were disrupted by complete family extinction, that laws had not anticipated occurring with frequency, requiring detailed statutory provisions addressing such situations. The legal proceedings that extended across 3 years from 1854 through 1857 involved multiple claimants asserting rights to inherit Cypress Ridge and to inherit approximately 60 enslaved people whose market value represented substantial portion of estate's total worth, even though land itself represented significant asset whose value had appreciated substantially during decades since Jonathan's father had originally acquired property during Florida's territorial period. The outcome of inheritance proceedings involved court ultimately awarding Cypress Ridge to Jonathan's cousin who lived in South Carolina and who had no interest in relocating to Florida to manage property directly. Cousin, whose solution involved appointing manager to operate Homestead, while cousin collected profits generated through continued cotton cultivation using enslaved labor, whose exploitation would continue under new ownership, despite Blackwell family's destruction having temporarily disrupted operations and having created period when enslaved workers at Cypress Ridge experienced reduced oversight and experienced relative autonomy that would be Eli minated once new manager arrived and reimposed strict discipline that slavery required for extracting profitable labor from workers whose resistance had to be prevented through systematic coercion backed by violence that new manager employed with enthusiasm, matching or exceeding Jonathan's harshness. Despite new manager lacking personal connection to property or to enslaved people, whose exploitation generated wealth flowing to absentee owner who viewed Cypress Ridge purely as economic asset, rather than as family heritage requiring preservation and requiring management, reflecting personal investment beyond mere financial calculations. The fate of patients following Jonathan's death and following Blackwell family's complete extinction involved her initial relief that revenge had been accomplished and that supernatural justice had punished family whose crimes against her justified destruction that voodoo work had allegedly delivered, relief that was complicated by recognition that new ownership and new management meant that conditions at Cypress Ridge might actually worsen rather than improve despite Blackwell family's absence, because new manager appointed by Jonathan's cousin proved to be person whose cruelty exceeded even Jonathan's harshness and whose suspicions about voodoo practices among enslaved workers led him to implement enhanced surveillance and enhanced punishment. Tests designed to suppress any conjure work that he believed represented threats to white authority, regardless of whether such work actually possessed supernatural power or whether it merely represented psychological resistance, whose symbolic significance exceeded its actual capacity to affect physical reality through mechanisms that rationalist frameworks insisted could not exist. The decision patients made in 1856, approximately 2 years after Jonathan's death, and after experiencing 2 years under new manager whose brutality had convinced her that remaining at Cypress Ridge was intolerable, regardless of risks involved in attempting escape, involved fleeing toward Union lines during early stages of Civil War, when federal military presence in Florida created opportunities for enslaved people to achieve freedom through Cherokee territory controlled by forces whose policies included accepting refugees from slavery and whose military power could protect escaped enslaved people against recapture attempts that Florida authorities and slave catchers would have mounted if not deterred by federal military superiority in contested regions. The escape that patients attempted in March 1856 involved traveling approximately 100 miles through territory where Confederate sympathizers and slave catchers maintained surveillance, attempting to prevent enslaved people from reaching federal lines. Travel that required navigating through swamps and through forests where concealment was possible, but where dangers included exposure to elements, insufficient food, disease-carrying mosquitoes, venomous snakes, and human pursuers, whose capture of escaped enslaved people generated bounty payments, incentivizing aggressive pursuit and incentivizing brutal treatment of captured refugees, whose resistance to recapture was suppressed through violence designed to terrorize other enslaved people contemplating similar escape attempts. The success of Patience's escape, despite enormous obstacles, involved combination of her determination to achieve freedom regardless of costs, her knowledge of conjure practices that she believed provided spiritual protection during journey through hostile territory, and assistance from networks of people, including some enslaved people and some free black people and some white abolitionists who maintained underground railroad operations, helping refugees navigate paths toward freedom, despite risks that such assistance created for helpers who could be prosecuted under Fugitive Slave Act if caught providing aid to escaped enslaved people whose owners claimed legal rights to recapture property that had fled naughty horde or that had fled toward federal military protection. The arrival at Union lines in April 1856, after a month-long journey covering approximately 100 miles, represented culmination of Patience's transformation from submissive domestic servant who had accepted enslavement as unchangeable reality through traumatized mother, whose children's sale had destroyed her psychological submission, through voodoo practitioner who had allegedly killed 6 white people through supernatural means, through fugitive, achieving freedom, whose meaning extended beyond mere legal status to include psychological liberation from internalized beliefs about white authorities' inevitability and about black people's powerlessness that slavery had systematically promoted to prevent resistance and to maintain psychological control, even when physical coercion alone might have proven insufficient for suppressing resistance from people whose determination to achieve freedom had exceeded their fear of consequences that resistance inevitably provoked. The legacy of Patience's story within African American communities throughout Florida and throughout broader South involved oral traditions preserving accounts about 6 voodoo dolls and 6 deaths whose timing and circumstances convinced generations of formerly enslaved people and their descendants that supernatural justice represented real force capable of punishing white people whose crimes human legal systems refused to prosecute and whose power appeared absolute, until spiritual resistance demonstrated that white authority possessed vulnerabilities that material resistance alone could not exploit effectively. The symbolic significance of story extended beyond questions about whether voodoo actually possessed supernatural power to kill through mechanisms transcending material causation. Story's importance involved demonstrating that enslaved people possessed agency and possessed capacity for resistance, even when legal systems denied such agency, and even when white violence suppressed physical resistance through overwhelming force backed by state authority and backed by racial ideologies, justifying black people's permanent subordination, regardless of moral considerations or regardless of universal human rights that abolitionist activists insisted applied equally to all people, regardless of racial classifications, that slavery depended on maintaining to justify treating some people as property whose exploitation generated wealth, supporting white supremacy's material foundations and supporting white supremacy's ideological claims about natural racial hierarchies, allegedly justifying existing social arrangements. The life Patience built, following her successful escape to Union lines in April 1856, involved transformation from traumatized enslaved mother whose children had been sold away and who had allegedly killed 6 white people through voodoo practices to free woman establishing independent existence in contraband camp, where federal military provided protection to escaped enslaved people whose legal status remained contested because Emancipation Proclamation would not be issued until 1863, and because federal policies during 1856 remained ambiguous about whether escaped enslaved people should be returned to masters claiming legal ownership or should be protected as refugees whose return would strengthen Confederate military capabilities by returning valuable labor to enemies whose economic systems depended on enslaved workers' exploitation. The work Patience found in contraband camp involved combination of domestic labor serving Union officers, agricultural work, cultivating crops feeding federal forces, and most significantly work as healer, drawing on knowledge about herbal medicines and about spiritual practices that she had learned from Delphine and from other elders within enslaved communities whose medical traditions combined African knowledge systems with practical experience treating illnesses and injuries that plantation physicians often ignored or treated inadequately because economic calculations meant that investing substantial resources in enslaved workers' healthcare was justified only when workers' economic value exceeded treatment costs. The reputation Patience developed within contraband camp community involved her being recognized as conjure woman, whose spiritual knowledge extended beyond mere herbal healing to include capacity for working voodoo that could protect against harm and that could potentially inflict harm on enemies threatening communities' safety or threatening individuals whose vulnerability made them targets for exploitation or violence. The requests for conjure work that Patience received from other escaped enslaved people in contraband camp included protections against illness, protections against recapture by slave catchers who continued operating despite federal military presence, creating risks for people attempting such captures, love charms attracting desired romantic partners, and occasionally requests for harmful work targeting people who had wronged petitioners in ways that conventional justice systems could not or would not address through legal mechanisms. The decision patients made about which request to accept involved her developing ethical framework, distinguishing between protective work and healing work that she considered morally justifiable regardless of clients' motivations versus harmful work that she would perform only when she concluded that target deserved punishment for crimes that human legal systems refused to prosecute or for cruelties that exceeded what even slavery's brutal norm as tolerated. The reunion that occurred in 1863, when patients encountered women who had been enslaved at neighboring Homestead to Cypress Ridge and who reported having seen Patience's 3 children at slave market in Tallahassee during 1854, shortly after they had been sold away from Patience and shortly before they had been transported to New Orleans for resale to buyers whose identities remained unknown despite Patience's desperate attempts to obtain information about her children's whereabouts and about their fates during decades since separation had occurred. The information woman provided included physical descriptions confirming that children she had seen were indeed Patience's children based on ages and based on distinctive features that Patience had described. Included report that children had appeared healthy despite obvious distress about separation from their mother and about uncertainty regarding where they were being taken, and included devastating news that woman had heard rumors suggesting that children had been sold to sugar plantation in Louisiana, where mortality rates for enslaved children remained extraordinarily high because brutal labor conditions combined with disease and inadequate nutrition killed workers at rates exceeding those at cotton plantations, where labor demands were less intense and where climate was less conducive to tropical diseases that thrived in Louisiana's swampy regions where sugar cultivation concentrated. The decision Patience faced about whether to attempt locating her children, despite enormous obstacles, involved weighing slim possibility that they might still be alive after a decade of enslavement in Louisiana's sugar regions versus certainty that attempting to locate them would require traveling hundreds of miles through territory where former Confederacy's collapse had created chaos but had not eliminated dangers facing black women traveling one through regions where white violence against black people was intensifying as white Southerners attempted to reassert racial dominance despite slavery's formal abolition and despite federal military occupation that provided inadequate protection against violence that occurred beyond areas where federal troops maintained direct control. The support Patience received from contraband camp community included several people volunteering to accompany her on journey, attempting to locate children whose survival remained questionable but whose potential recovery represented hope that Patience clung to despite rational calculations, suggesting that odds of successfully finding 3 specific individuals among hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people scattered throughout Louisiana and throughout other Gulf Coast states remained extraordinarily low, even if children had survived a decade of brutal labor that killed most enslaved children working Louisiana's sugar plantations before they reached adulthood. The journey that Patience and 3 companions undertook during fall of 1863, following Emancipation Proclamation's issuance, but before Civil War's conclusion, involved traveling approximately 600 miles from Florida contraband camp through Georgia and through Alabama into Louisiana, where they would attempt to locate sugar plantations, where Patience's children might have been sold, and where they might still be living if they had survived conditions that killed most enslaved workers within 5 years of arrival. The dangers encountered during journey included white violence from former Confederates and from civilian vigilantes targeting black travelers whose mobility challenged white expectations that black people should remain stationary and should remain subordinate to white authority despite formal legal emancipation, included diseases including yellow fever and malaria that thrived in Gulf Coast regions through which they traveled, included lack of adequate food and shelter because resources available to black travelers remained minimal in regions where white people controlled most resources and where white hostility toward black people's independence meant that assistance was rarely provided willingly and sometimes was actively denied, even when travelers possessed money to purchase supplies that white merchants refused to sell. The discovery that occurred in Louisiana during December 1863, after months of searching and after inquiries at dozens of former sugar plantations where Patience's children might have been sold, involved finally locating two surviving children, daughter, now 19 years old, and son, now 17, who had been enslaved at same Louisiana plantation where they had been sold in 1854 and where they had survived conditions that killed 3 of every farm. Our children sold into sugar cultivation before reaching adulthood, survival that they attributed partly to luck and partly to spiritual protections that they believed their mother's prayers and their mother's conjure work had provided despite physical separation, preventing direct intervention. The reunion between Patience and 2 surviving children after a decade of separation involved mixture of joy at discovering they had survived and grief about third child, Patience's youngest son, who had been only 5 years old when sold away, who had died in 1856 from fever contracted during harvest season, when 18-hour work days, 7 days weekly, during months when sugarcane had to be cut and processed immediately before frost destroyed crop. Airs created conditions where exhausted children's immune systems could not fight infections that better rested bodies might have overcome. The decision that Patience and 2 surviving children made about whether to remain in Louisiana or to return to Florida involved weighing opportunities available in each location against dangers that characterized both regions during period when Reconstruction policies were beginning to transform South's political and social structures through federal military enforcement of black citizenship rights and through policies including Freedmen's Bureau, or operations providing assistance to formerly enslaved people attempting to establish independent lives after decades or generations of bondage that had denied them opportunities to accumulate property or to develop skills beyond agricultural labor that slavery had required from most enslaved people, regardless of their individual capabilities or interests. The ultimate decision to return to Florida involved Patience's 2 children, recognizing that contraband camp community, where their mother had established reputation as healer and as spiritual practitioner, offered better opportunities for building stable lives than Louisiana offered, given that state's particularly intense white resistance to black people's citizenship rights, and given violence that Louisiana's white population was beginning to employ systematically to suppress black political participation and to suppress black economic advancement, that Reconstruction policies attempted to facilitate through federal intervention that would prove inadequate for overcoming determined resistance from white Southerners committed to maintaining racial hierarchy despite slavery's formal abolition. The life Patience established in Florida during Reconstruction years and during subsequent decades extending until her death in 1899 at age 74 involved her continuing work as healer and as conjure woman, serving black communities throughout region where her reputation extended beyond local contraband camp to encompass broader population of formerly enslaved people and their descendants, whose needs for medical care and whose needs for spiritual assistance exceeded what conventional medicine and conventional Christianity could provide, given limitations of medical knowledge during 19th century, and given ways that white-controlled Christian institutions had compromised themselves through supporting slavery or through remaining silent about slavery's injustices. The knowledge Patience transmitted to apprentices who learned conjure practices from her during final decades of her life included not merely technical procedures for creating voodoo dolls or for preparing herbal remedies, but more importantly, included ethical frameworks distinguishing between protective work and healing work that served communities' interests versus harmful work that should be undertaken only when justified through target's crime, as exceeding what community norms tolerated or what human justice systems adequately punished. The oral tradition preserving Patience's story across generations from her 1899 death through her granddaughter Clara's 1923 interview with folklorist and through subsequent transmission to contemporary historians and to contemporary descendants of enslaved people at Cypress Ridge, involved story evolving through multiple retellings whose details varied depending on tellers' purposes and depending on audiences' receptivity to supernatural explainer. Tie-ins for events that rationalist frameworks insisted required material causation rather than spiritual causation, whose existence European intellectual traditions systematically denied, despite African spiritual traditions' insistence that reality included dimensions transcending material mechanisms that scientific methodologies could measure or verify. The debate among historians examining Patience's story involves familiar questions about whether 6 deaths within 6 months following voodoo dolls' activation represented genuine supernatural causation or represented tragic coincidence that believers interpreted as confirming their spiritual beliefs. Debate whose resolution depends entirely on epistemological frameworks that participants bring to evidence, whose interpretation remains fundamentally contested because material evidence cannot definitively prove or disprove supernatural causation, whose operation by definition transcends material realm, where scientific methods operate, and where empirical verification through controlled experiments represents standard for accepting causal claims. Valid. The contemporary relevance of Patience's story extends beyond historical curiosity about voodoo practices within enslaved communities to illuminate broader questions about resistance, about power, about agency within oppressive systems, and about how people subjected to systematic violence and systematic denial of humanity maintained psychological survival and maintained hope despite circumstances that appeared designed to destroy both psychological integrity and future-oriented hope necessary for continued resistance against conditions that appeared permanent and unchangeable. The recognition that Patience transformed from submissive enslaved woman, accepting her bondage as unchangeable reality, into person who allegedly killed 6 white people through voodoo practices and who eventually achieved freedom through dangerous escape, represents narrative arc, demonstrating that enslaved people possessed capacities for resistance and possessed capacities for agency that slavery's ideological frameworks insisted they lacked. Cow's acknowledging such capacities would have undermined justifications for slavery, whose continuation depended on maintaining beliefs about black people's supposed inferiority, requiring their subordination to supposedly superior white people, whose authority slavery's defenders insisted represented natural order, reflecting divine will, rather than representing human constructions that could be challenged and could be changed through collective act. High on and through moral arguments about universal human rights that slavery systematically violated. The memorial established at site where Cypress Ridge had operated, property that, like most former plantation properties, had been subdivided and developed during 20th century, but where historical marker now commemorated enslaved people whose labor and whose suffering had generated wealth enriching Blackwell family, until that family's mysterious extinction during 1854, following Patience's creation of 6 voodoo dolls, allegedly killing 6 family members through supernatural means, included acknowledgement of debates about whether supernatural causation, or natural causes, adequately explained 6 deaths, whose timing and whose circumstances remained subject to competing interpretations depending on observers' epistemological commitments and depending on observers' willingness to consider African spiritual traditions as possessing validity comparable to European rationalist frameworks, whose hegemony within academic institutions and within broader intellectual culture reflected colonial power dynamics, privileging European knowledge systems over African knowledge systems, whose suppression represented integral aspect of slavery's operations and whose continued marginalization within contemporary scholarship represents ongoing legacy of colonial and slavery-era hierarchies that positioned European knowledge as universal and scientific, while positioning African knowledge as particular and superstitious, despite both representing culturally specific ways of understanding reality whose validity cannot be adjudicated through appeals to supposedly neutral standards that actually reflect particular cultural assumptions masquerading as universal truths. The terrifying true story of Patience, enslaved mother whose 3 children ages 5, 7, and 9 were sold away from Cypress Ridge Homestead in Florida on November 15, 1853, by owner Jonathan Blackwell, as punishment for allegedly stealing silver spoon that Patience insisted she had not taken, but whose denials Jonathan refused to accept, because accepting enslaved person's word against white person's suspicions would have violated slavery's fundamental premises requiring masters' judgments remain unquestioned, who learned voodoo practices from woman named Delphine at Cypress Ridge and created 6 dolls representing Jonathan, his wife Martha, and their 4 children, whose ritual activation through pins, herbs, incantations, and blood offerings during January 1854 allegedly produced 6 deaths occurring between March and August 1854, including Jonathan's youngest daughter Mary, dying suddenly in sleep on March 3rd, Jonathan's son Robert, drowning mysteriously in shallow pond on April 17th, Jonathan's eldest daughter Caroline dying from rapid fever on May 22nd, Jonathan's middle daughter Elizabeth apparently hanging herself on June 8th, Martha dying from respiratory illness on July 14th, and finally Jonathan dying from apparent heart attack on August 9th, under circumstances suggesting terror rather than peaceful sudden death that physicians insisted characterized cardiac failures, represents one of most extensively documented cases of voodoo practices within enslaved communities whose oral traditions preserved stories about supernatural justice, punishing white families whose cruelty exceeded even slavery's normal brutality, and whose systematic destruction convinced generations of formerly enslaved people that spiritual resistance represented real force capable of accomplishing what physical resistance alone could not achieve against overwhelming white violence and against legal systems that refused to prosecute crimes white people committed against black people. If this chilling account of 6 voodoo dolls and 6 deaths, whose timing and circumstances forced even skeptics to wonder whether coincidence adequately explained pattern that believers insisted represented divine or supernatural justice, how patients escaped to Union lines in 1856 and eventually reunited with 2 surviving children in Louisiana, discovering third child had died in 1856 from fever. How patients spent remaining decades until 1899, death working as healer and conjure woman transmitting knowledge about protective work and about ethical frameworks, distinguishing justified harmful work from unjustified violence. If this story has made you question whether supernatural causation deserves consideration, or whether material explanations adequately account for events that African spiritual traditions insist transcend mechanisms that European rationalist frameworks recognize as valid, whether Patience's alleged killing of 6 white people through voodoo represented legitimate resistance or represented actions whose moral status remains contested, whether oral traditions preserving such stories across generations represent reliable historical sources or represent mythologies whose symbolic significance exceeds their factual accuracy, then subscribe immediately to explore more stories challenging comfortable assumptions about slavery and resistance. Like to spread accounts documenting African spiritual practices that slavery attempted to suppress. Comment where you're watching from and whether you believe voodoo actually killed Blackwell family or whether 6 deaths in 6 months represented extraordinary coincidence whose interpretation depended on observers' prior beliefs about supernatural causation's possibility. Share with others who need to understand that Patience's story demonstrates enslaved people's agency and resistance operating through spiritual means when physical resistance would have been immediately suppressed. That debates about supernatural versus natural causation reflect deeper epistemological conflicts between African and European knowledge systems whose relative validity cannot be determined through supposedly neutral standards that actually privilege European frameworks, and that contemporary dismissal of voodoo as mere superstition represents ongoing legacy of colonial hierarchies that systematically marginalized African knowledge systems while positioning European rationality as universal truth, deserving exclusive recognition within academic and intellectual institutions, whose claimed objectivity masks cultural assumptions requiring examination and requiring challenges from perspectives that slavery and colonialism attempted to eliminate, but that survived through oral traditions and through spiritual practices that enslaved people maintained, despite systematic suppression and despite ongoing stigmatization that continues marginalizing African-derived spiritual systems within societies still structured by racial hierarchies, whose origins trace directly to slavery and to ideologies justifying black people's exploitation through denying their humanity and through denying validity of their knowledge systems, including spiritual traditions, that Patience employed allegedly killing 6 people whose deaths represented justice that human legal systems refused to deliver.